Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. So I hope everybody's had a very enlightening morning. There's been wonderful sharing. So today I'm actually presenting on inequalities and poverty. It's such a broad, two very broad topics. But the intention is more to give some overview or to share some perspectives that include sociology and the integration of knowledge in this context. Of course, it is more to start some conversations and thoughts, and also perhaps we have participants who are experts or students that are from other fields and courses that do study inequalities and poverty as well. So we understand that inequalities and poverty are topics that are studied across multiple fields, including economics, politics, and so on. So perhaps today we start off to examine a little bit more on the sociological perspectives and introduce some brief or basic theories that discusses inequalities and poverty. So I know that today's course or sharing is not looking deeply, rather more broadly. When we say inequalities or when we say stratification, it's another term that we use as well. What we want to refer to or what we want to look at is actually a difference that is systematic in nature and also systemic in nature in terms of access to resources and also opportunities. So this could be looking at multiple dimensions of things, including access to economic resources and opportunities, access to educational resources and opportunities, and so on. So it may be coming from structural factors, as we will look a bit later on, such as social class, race, ethnicities, gender, for example, and perhaps also geographic and geopolitical locations. So the previous lecture by Dr. Daniel on Islamophobia may be some important areas that we can look at as well. So when we say inequality from the sociological perspective, we're not just looking at individuals and their individual circumstances or consequences that they experience or experiences that they have personally only, but we recognize that there are societal structures and that there are institutions that also carry parts of these inequalities and perpetuates these inequalities. So that's most of the focus of today's sharing. So in sociology, often we look at this term called social stratification rather than using the word inequalities. So the word stratification comes from the root word strata, often looking at different types of ranking of people in a particular society. So different forms of stratification can include social class. We can also look at different ways that people are stratified or ranked in terms of gender or in terms of ethnicity, or in some societies there is a caste system. So when we talk about social stratification, we also believe that there is a belief system behind this stratification. So there are some predictable rules. We understand certain rules exist behind this ranking. Therefore, it is something to be understood and something that can be studied. And there are theories that are employed or that can be used to understand and to also highlight these forms of differences or these explanations that are given to these types of differences. Therefore, we say predictable. So these systems of stratification is also or is upheld by some form of legitimation. So it may be, for example, if we think about meritocracy as a system of stratification. So there is some way of ranking people, and then there is a legitimizing of the ranking, and because of the legitimizing of the ranking, therefore there may be an unequal distribution of different things, such as goods. This could be monetary in nature, economic goods. It could be in terms of services that people deserve or are expected to deserve through the legitimization. And then, of course, we understand that there may be also unequal distribution of prestige in how we perceive each other, who we respect more, or who we perceive to have certain higher levels in society. So we acknowledge that social stratification or social inequalities exist and have always existed, and perhaps will continue to exist as long as human beings are there. But we want to also understand and explain what are areas that we want to look at. And today's course or topic is more on inequalities specifically, rather than looking at stratification, just ranking. So inequality. Sorry, I think I was logged out. Just give me a moment. Not sure what happened there. Could someone share with me in the chat where I last dropped off, so maybe I could go back? This is Syarifah. Where was I?
Yes, Doctor. Just now only, Doctor.
All right. Okay. So I don't know what happened. So I was saying just now, I think the other sociology academics and lectures that's been delivering on sociology topics in the last 14 weeks have always highlighted these theories. So these are classical sociology theories: Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber. But today I also bring in Pierre Bourdieu as one of the theories to look at as well. So it is not to say that these are the only theorists who have looked at inequalities. These are more classical theories and more of a starting point. Of course, in the contemporary context, the conversations around inequalities and stratification have actually garnered more attention. And there's actually been more work that have looked into different areas of inequalities and have expounded even more deeply into the details of the structures and the legitimization of inequalities in more contemporary context in terms of the systems of power of today. So it is to more likely conversation. These are the only available theories, but this is more of the starting points of discussion on inequalities. So we start first with Karl Marx. So Karl Marx lives in the realm of sociology, economics, and politics in many different ways. And in terms of the discussion on inequality, we can say that from the sociological perspective, Marx's work to highlight social class, especially in the context of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, was one of the earlier ones we saw. And of course, he didn't quite complete this work in his final work. But we see that in the context of Marx, it was very important for him to highlight the material differences and how this is not just in terms of the capitalist society that was then a rather recent economic system and also a power system at the time. So Marx says in the Communist Manifesto that he wrote with Engels, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, is to highlight that class struggle or social class have always existed, and it was always part of human society. And so he gave some examples of earlier forms of social class and how that happened. And he also highlighted that it was always something that was embedded within the system and the structures of the system. So he has done quite elaborate work in terms of social class. And then we have a structural functionalist, okay, Emil Durkheim, who takes a more functionalist perspective on inequalities, although there has not actually been a lot that Emil Durkheim himself wrote specifically on stratification and inequalities, but we see at least the identification that he made on external and internal inequalities. So he highlighted that there are two main types of inequalities. The first is the external inequalities. This external inequalities is imposed on an individual by social circumstances, meaning that it is our ascribed status. Maybe by birth we are born into a certain type of family, a certain social class, and not something that we work for, or not something that we had done anything to deserve it, for example, or to attain it. And then we have internal inequalities, which is inequalities that is based on individual talent or achieved status. So Durkheim is a functionalist, and functionalists believe that the system works in a particular way for the good of the society. And there are some justifications to why certain inequalities happen, maybe due to certain functions and abilities that one has or the roles that one carries in society. And according to Durkheim, so Durkheim actually was discussing in the context of these inequalities two types of systems. So the earlier system that society was using was the mechanical solidarity system, in which the mechanical solidarity is a system by which people come together because we have more similarities than we have differences. And the way that we are united, or our solidarity, is based on these similarities. And we are held together like a mechanical structure of gears. Gears that can be put together because they match each other and they work well and function well as a system because of the similarity. And external inequalities are more seen and visible in the mechanical solidarity form of societies. So Marx, Weber, Durkheim are scholars or are thinkers who existed or who lived during the time of early capitalism and discuss a lot more on the arrival of capitalism and consequences of the state of capitalism at the time. So they were discussing this in those contexts. So when Durkheim was discussing internal inequalities, he was looking at the changes that were brought about by capitalism. And he saw that as societies became more modern and more urbanized, that we were more united, or our solidarity now can be seen as what we called organic, or what he called organic solidarity. So our differences are what unites us, and the division of our labor became more specialized and more unique. So it is our difference that brings us together. So we have very specialized ways of doing things and of contributing to societies and performing our roles. So think about societies today and how specialized we are at the work that we do, and where we get sustenance or day-to-day things. We go to specialized areas or places to get certain things. And that's really broken down to so many differences, but we all sort of are interdependent of each other, and we need one another to stay together. So our solidarity is more organic because of our differences, no longer mechanical. And Durkheim had concerns of issues of internal inequalities because of how we then distribute division of labor and then distribute resources as a result of those division of labor, and how then we can come together. I think maybe perhaps previous weeks have also touched on Durkheim's idea of anemia, or the lack of normlessness as a result of, or perhaps one of the consequences of organic solidarity. So the third theorist we will look at is Max Weber. So Max Weber actually, or Weber moved from Karl Marx's work on class, and recognized that there are two forms of division. So extending the work of Marx, he recognized that yes, class-based division is important to acknowledge that um, we may also look at two areas of certain types of labor, or due to capitalism and private ownership. The second is on the occupational skills, meaning how one relates to the marketplace. And then Marx identified from the stratification perspective that it's not just about the material wealth, but also there is a division that can happen, or ranking that can happen, that is based off honor, based off status, prestige. And these are important values, not just something that is cultural, but it also is reflected in other forms of powers. And this becomes really important because from the sociological perspectives, we later on see more expansion here to acknowledge the political and organizational power. So this is definitely something that was very significant in terms of not just understanding, but highlighting from the structural context, because we see as bureaucracy complex and have become much more complex today, these structures and the legitimization of inequalities existed in a more bureaucratized way, that we bureaucratize certain things. So we can think about the merits or the meritocracy, and how we understand what merit is, and how we justify and legitimize certain types of merits, and how this later translates into forms of stratification, ranking within bureaucracies. So this is very interesting progress in terms of how sociologists at the time have expanded more on looking at social structures, cultures, that highlights how we can understand inequalities and stratification from a uniquely sociological perspective. So moving from Marx and Weber, although I didn't highlight just now, as a result of Marx and Weber's work, we have a more contemporary theory by Eric Olin Wright, who highlighted the four-class model. So the four-class model is actually a combination of both the Marxist and the Weberian theories to highlight four main class models. And so the first one is the capitalist. So we understand that Marx highlighted that the main social class were the bourgeoisie, or the capitalists, and the proletariats, or the working class. So the capitalists, according to Wright, okay, are individuals who own large enterprises. They have control over the means of production. And of course, similar to Marx, Wright highlights that they benefit from the profits that they get from the businesses, and therefore they have not just substantial economic power, but also power within the system. And then we have the petty bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie are smaller business owners. So if we think about Marx's idea of capitalism and the bourgeoisie, it's as though all the capitalists form the same group. But Wright acknowledges that there are smaller business owners who actually are not larger conglomerates, for example, and they do not have the same level of wealth as the capitalist. And they may have some workers, so they may not have large organizations like the capitalists, and therefore they become more vulnerable, or they are inherently more vulnerable to market fluctuations or competition. So thinking about everyday small business owners in our towns or in our cities who are not as stable or strongly powerful as the capitalists of larger organizations. And interestingly, Wright highlights that there is actually one contradictory class location, which is the managers. The managers and supervisors, they hold positions that give them authority over the workers of the capitalists generally. But they themselves do not have any ownership of the production of means. So they have authority, but they don't have ownership. Yet they play such a critical role actually in the organization. So they perform as intermediaries between the capitalists and the workers, but they themselves do not actually benefit much from the ownership of production. So that's why Wright highlights that this social class is a contradictory class location for the managers. They are neither the capitalists, but they are also not the workers in terms of authority. And then, right, of course, we have the workers. So the workers are actually people who sell their labor for wages. And this is not different from Marx's idea of social class or the proletariats. So because they do not have private ownership to the production of means, therefore they have very little or limited power in terms of the workplace. So although I'm unable to explain these concepts here today fully, but I think I may highlight some ideas that you can look for later if these are new to you. So Marx also talked about the alienation as a result of capitalism. And these forms of alienation would be interesting later on when we look at how they are interrelated. And we're not just looking at, and we're not just talking about economics, but we're talking about people's way of life and people's idea of prestige and how we classify ourselves as a result of the economic model of capitalism. So the concept of alienation is actually very pertinent and very important. So if you are ever wanting to read more, then you can have a look at the concept of alienation from Marx's perspective. Right, so it's as though we're going through many theories at once, but hopefully it will all come together sort of in the end. The fourth and final theorist that we will look at actually to highlight is Pierre Bourdieu, a French theorist that became very popular actually from the American sociological perspective, especially as there have been quite a number of work later on that drew from Bourdieu's theory of the capital. So using this concept of the capital, so what is a capital? Basically, a capital is something that can be used or that can contribute to the level of inequality. So because it has to do with resources and access to resources and opportunities that one may have. So Bourdieu divides it into 4 forms of capital that one may have or one may lack. So there is, of course, very relatable economic capital where it is maybe financial or other material form of capital. So maybe having access to money, having access to property, having access to technology, for example. And then we also have what we call the cultural capital. This is quite interesting. So Bourdieu highlights that not just knowledge, but certain taste. So what do we mean when we say taste? So Bourdieu highlights, for example, a certain taste in music, for example, or fashion, that we are able to distinguish one another. So think about how we have this idea of or what attires we wear and how we speak. And what kinds of art that we appreciate, what forms of music that we listen to, and how we differentiate one another, and perhaps even give opportunities to others based on how we define these ideas of the cultural capital. So think about if you have access to authority or power to run an interview of a candidate for a certain role, we notice very quickly certain cultural capital that the candidate possesses, how they speak or how they dress, what accent they use, for example, what are things that they speak about, what are their interests, what hobbies they have. These are what we call cultural capital. And then we have social capital. So these are people that we are connected to or that one is connected to. It could be our family, our network, our relationship. So we can think about a child, for example, who um, may be coming from a lower income group, but goes to a school where the teachers are very resourceful, versus another child who comes from a lower income group not having access to a resourceful teacher. So the teacher is one example of the social capital that a person may have. So it could also be family. So a child may come from parents who do not have high education, so may not have a good income and not be able to help with homework, but they may have an auntie or an uncle who is able to give them that access. So that's the social capital. So these social capital also, like the other forms of capital, can increase one's access to resource and one's access to opportunities. And then we have, of course, the symbolic capital. This has to do with qualifications, prestige related contacts and honors and reputation of the person themselves, for example. So according to Bordeaux, all of these capitals they are interrelated and they sort of add on to one another. So having one can add to another. So having a social capital can add to one's cultural capital. So maybe having an uncle or an auntie who is more refined in certain ways can give one this cultural capital needed to access certain groups and certain economic capital. So for example, if we think as adults, maybe having a network to somebody who knows somebody that can give you an opportunity to something else. So Bordeaux's theory of capital gives us a more complex ideas of how inequalities exist and how they can be perpetuated, and how for some groups of people it can be maintained within the same groups of people. So another way of looking at and understanding inequalities from the sociological perspective. So we think about what are some of the broader factors that contribute to inequalities. Of course, we understand just now, we've highlighted that there are economic systems relating to how wealth is distributed in societies. And then earlier just now, we also saw that there are social structures that also highlights or contributes to disparity of, or increasing perhaps even the gap of inequalities. And then there are, of course, cultural factors relating to prestige, relating to symbols that we believe, or the belief system that legitimizes certain types of inequalities. And this could also include gender as well, as a form of cultural factors that can contribute to inequalities. So now we go more deeply into a form of inequality. So poverty is one form of inequality. And I understand that oftentimes when we talk about poverty, the main question or the main discussion is more on the economic aspect. But today I want to highlight the other aspects that are related to poverty. So there are different ways in which poverty is measured, and often it is based on a certain level of income. So perhaps different countries have different measurements of poverty, and we also have a more global kind of measurement of inequality. So we know that the World Bank defines poverty as living on less than $1.90 a day. But also the World Bank acknowledges that there is a concept of multi-dimensional poverty. So traditionally, measuring poverty from the economic perspective uses these two measures, which is the absolute poverty and also the relative poverty. But in the current context, we use a more multi-dimensional poverty. This gives a more comprehensive view of how poverty exists and how poverty is perpetuated. So the multi-dimensional poverty perspective is more looking at deprivations in many ways. So I will not highlight too much on the economic perspective, because we're going to look at how we can understand it from a more sociological perspective. So although we often look at these earlier two types of the absolute and relative, I think the multidimensional poverty now brings in a more interdisciplinary perspective that is closer to the sociological discussions on poverty and inequality. So we can see that now there is an acknowledgement that there are other dimensions of poverty beyond income, of understanding access to nutrition, access to education, and not just measuring the monetary or the economic aspect of accessing education, but acknowledging how long one is in education, is one able to attend school, recognizing also that living standards are important beyond the monetary value of things, perhaps looking at having access to sanitation, access to electricity, and so on. So we try to discuss these questions or these discussions from the Islamic perspective, as well as we've gone and looked into the Western descriptions from the sociological theorists earlier. And we have explanations within the Islamic context from the Quranic verses and also from the prophetic teachings to highlight that, number one, inequalities exist, and there is an acknowledgement of inequalities existing, but there is a more of a tawhidic epistemology, a tawhidic aspect to it, that it is Allah who distributed wealth, and He chooses to distribute it the way that He wants it here, and placing certain people as having higher access to wealth than others. So we see this in Surah Al-Zukhruf, verse 32. We also see it in other parts of the Quran as well. In Surah Ar-Rum, for example, there are also explanations here that for some people, Allah has given them abundance, and for some people, Allah has given them limited provisions. And these are signs for us to think about. I think the first message being that it was given by Allah, rather than in terms of thinking of people's efforts and labor that is put in, but rather as provisions given in the forms of wealth that Allah has given to them. So we have an explanation here from a more economic context to highlight that from the Islamic perspective, there is a system that is in place from the Islamic perspective in terms of the redistribution of wealth. And this is to reduce the gap, but it is to be established by human beings, given that the system has already been revealed. Humans have the responsibility to uphold the structure. So the structure is built. Number one, it is acknowledging that inequalities persist, and that is the way that Allah has decided, and He gives some people more than others. But in the same way, Allah has also revealed to us systems of distribution of wealth in the context of social finances or Islamic finances. We have zakat, we have wakaf, we also have the concept of sadaqah and the care of each other. So there is already a strong system that is supposed to manage some form of equilibrium or redistribution of wealth and gap. Not to totally, and it is not in the context that the human being has the capacity to completely and finally address inequalities in its final form, because it will continue to happen, but the constant effort is needed to always manage the redistribution, and that is part of the human test and human life, that we have to continue to redistribute in terms of individuals' effort of paying zakat, of doing sadaqah, but also there are structural contexts that are placed in terms of the zakat institution and so on. So there is the individual effort, but also there are structures in place, acknowledging that there must be more structural and institutional forms of managing the inequalities that exist in terms of the economic inequality. So we know that inequalities, although it exists, the large gaps of inequalities and poverty as it exists today has many negative and detrimental consequences, especially when the gaps of inequalities are too large. And we know that the country's GDP does not necessarily reflect inequality of or the inequality levels within a country. So this is actually taken from Wiki Impact, which is a study on Malaysia in terms of the impact of poverty from the Malaysian context. Of course, there have been studies abroad and also studies from all parts of the world looking at poverty, and we know that in terms of the current practice of the SDG, number one is no poverty, right? So this is a focus on today's, well, it has been a focus even before SDG and MDG level as well. Yet we still see and we still notice that there are broadening gaps of inequalities and poverty in some parts of the world, while in some others there are smaller or reduced levels of inequality. So we understand that while poverty may be understood in the context of the contemporary, we also understand that for those in poverty and those who experience inequality, there is this concept of the cycle of poverty. And this cycle indicates that there can be broadening of disparities for certain more vulnerable groups of people. And as the inequality levels expand in one society or the gaps grow larger, we know that there will be also, or there can be also, risk of social unrest. So I want to highlight one aspect that sociology brings to the study of inequalities and poverty that is often missed in more quantitative or a more broad kind of perspective. So in sociology, there is also an emphasis on the lived reality, which is often studied from a qualitative perspective. This allows us to better understand the experiences of those living in vulnerability that may not be seen through the statistics that is taken from an economic perspective. Recognizing also that now in economics perspective, there is also more studies on lived realities. So although statistics are really important to highlight and address issues of poverty, numbers alone do not really give us a picture of the hardship and challenges or the realities of those who live within the context of poverty and inequalities. And from the sociological perspective, we recognize that inequalities, like stratification earlier, that there is a form of legitimization, there is a belief system that upholds it, and there is also systems that continue to perpetuate it. So we know that poverty is not randomly distributed. There are certain vulnerabilities or stratification within the society that significantly influences the likelihood of one to experience poverty and to continue on with that, and then perpetuating the cycle of poverty. So not just monetary measures must be looked into, but also non-monetary measures from the symbolic and cultural perspective must also be considered when we think about inequalities, specifically looking at poverty. I had come here early on in the previous weeks to talk about family, actually, and I want to also highlight that when we think about cycles of poverty, it is also important to highlight or to focus on how family experiences poverty and how poverty is not just an individual experience, but often we use the term household, but I think it's such a sterile word to say household rather than to understand the context of families. And as Muslims, I think to acknowledge the aspect of the familial experience is also important. I want to highlight these excerpts, but also I think it's very important for us to think about, especially in the context of what's been happening with the genocide of Gaza by the Zionists, is to think about how we often, or it's often used this term of privilege and what it means. But from the sociological perspective, I think this excerpt gives us a good picture of what are considerations to think about. So here it says low-income families laugh at what middle-class families consider nuances that could ruin a perfect day. So a car breaking down for a middle class could be a problem, but for the low-income families, there is no car to break to start with, right? Or a child getting sick is nothing compared to knowing that you don't have, your child might die in the context of extreme poverty and extreme hunger, for example. So these are considerations that may feel important to different social class, but it is definitely a more real and aggravated conditions in the context of another social class. And I think this is really important for us to think about in the modern or in today's context, because we live in such separate lives. In some of our societies, our planning of the urban planning of the world itself divides us, and we don't see one another, and we can live in such sterile lives of how we give sadaqah through scanning a QR code. We've never seen our neighbors, and never knowing the hardship of our neighbors, and never being present to be there, rather than it's just more very digital, very separated, very isolated. So there may be somebody who is near us who is a miskin, but we don't know it, and we don't notice it because of the way that the structures of our lives today, and these structures exist because we continue to perpetuate it in the social form. So as time go by, there is a normalization of poverty, and there is a normalization of distress for certain groups of people, because we believe that that's what it should look like, and that's what it's supposed to be. And because we are very separated from one another, we do not, or we no longer have sensitivity towards these challenges. And I think as we go on a little bit more in a few slides, showing the values that have been highlighted to us by the Prophet and also from the Quran, there is something for us to think about deeply, and for us to highlight in a more soft way, rather than thinking about it systemically in a sterile way, in thinking about how we are connected to one another and how we address one another in a human form that is more rahmah in nature. So of course, to address poverty, there must be structural changes, institutional changes. Access to education is one of the ways that we think about breaking poverty cycles. There should be community level changes as well. I want to show actually some of these ways that have been highlighted from the Islamic perspective, because I don't think I have much time left. But I highlight some of the Islamic values in addressing inequalities and poverty through the Quranic context, to highlight that aspect that I was mentioning earlier, and what are the values in which we address poverty. So in Surah Al-Ma'un, Allah revealed to us that we must have a sense of responsibility to address the poor and the needy and the yatim here, as a form of justice, as a form of not just to give charity because we are better or we are more, but it is how things should be, and therefore we have a responsibility to act on it as a form of justice, and that they have a right on us. And it is not, I think sometimes there is a perceived action of helping because we are saving people, rather than it is an act of justice and what should be. And at the same time, there must be also a context of helping the less fortunate in a way that is gracious and in a way that is respectful. And this has to do with how we run not just in terms of individual organizational and structural thinking about. We can look at as well may include productive welfare and how we run productive welfare in some societies. I think for Muslims in particular, the emphasis must be that wealth is not ours. Inna lillahi wa inna ilaihi raji'un. Everything comes from Allah, and everything will return to Allah. In the same way, wealth is not one's possession for oppressing another, nor is it for pride, and therefore it is a means to live and exist in this dunya, and it's also a means of attaining Allah's rida on us. So in this kind of context, we can understand a different way of looking at the way that wealth is redistributed, and that when wealth is given to one person, it is actually a form of trust, and not just for repayment of one's effort. In the capitalist context, or in the meritocracy context, even in society that we live in today, often there is a lack of understanding of why we have certain levels of wealth. We may feel that it is because of the deservedness of our efforts of putting in certain types of labor, and therefore we deserve a certain output or outcome. So the Islamic perspectives gives us a more tawhidic view and a reorientation of how we understand wealth and how it is meant to be redistributed. And in the context of inequalities, I think finally, just to highlight as a way of looking at it as a closing of today's sharing from me, was the last sermon of the Prophet ﷺ, that he highlighted that all mankind was from Adam and Hawa, okay, and that no Arab has superiority over a non-Arab, highlighting that there should not be superiority also in terms of race, except for piety and good action in terms of how we manage our actions, but not in terms of productivity as we see today in terms of capitalist perspective. And that is really important, that every Muslim is a brother to every Muslim, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender, regardless of our geographic location, and also our wealth. And we all constitute one ummah. And therefore, nothing shall be legitimate to a Muslim which belongs to a fellow Muslims unless it was given freely and willingly, that we share willingly with one another. And I hope that is sufficient. And I know that there is not enough time to finish highlighting a lot of the issues. So I think I will pass the floor back to Sister Juwairiyah.